Welcome back. We hope you enjoyed the time exploring your model and learning how to use it. If you've reached this point, you're probably asking yourself, how in the world are we going to clean these models up? And that's what this part of the video is going to try and demonstrate. Our tips to try and clean up these groundwater models in a relatively short amount of time. The first thing I'm going to have you do, if you've written on your model, the way in which you clean it, just a semi-wet cloth will allow you to kind of wipe away any of the marker that you might have used to maybe draw the water table. If you wrote on it at all, a semi-damp cloth will allow you to get that marker off. Once you've got all the marker cleaned off the surface, the next step is to start cleaning the dye out of the model. Now, how do we clean up groundwater? One of the only ways is to, a lot of times, just let clean precipitation, clean rain and snowmelt push some of the pollutants out. That's the way in the natural world that a lot of times we have to clean up groundwater, is just let nature do its job by pushing some of that contamination out. But there are things that we can sometimes do to speed that process up. And the one thing we're going to do in this model is remove the contamination source. So if we take our syringe that we use to add some of that dye to the model, we're going to basically pull some of the contamination out. If we don't remove the pollution from the piezometers, we're going to have that dye or that contamination in that piezometer for a long time. So we can speed this process up by basically sucking the most concentrated pollution or contamination out of that tube. We want to suck the most concentrated dye out of all the piezometers. And if we used our injection wells, here, we're going to want to make sure that we don't forget those. Because if we add dye to the injection wells and we forget to get or remove that dye out, we might get this model entirely cleaned up. The next day or a week later, you come in and there might be dye in that model again. And that's generally what happens if we forget to remove the dye from the piezometers. Slowly over time, that dye in that piezometer is going to trickle out back into that model. Once you've sucked all the polluted or most contaminated dye out, then we're going to use clean water. So you can use some of the clean water in your bottles to basically push the rest of that contamination out. So similar to how we added dye to the model, we're gonna use that same process where we suck that air gap out and then we inject that clean water to push that dye out. And now sometimes it does work better if we have clean precipitation already flowing in here. So I'm going to add that a clean bottle of recharge to our model here. And that's going to start pushing that contaminated groundwater out. And again, to speed that process up, we're going to inject some of that clean water into each of these piezometers to try and push that contaminated dye from those piezometers into the aquifer. Do that here with the green and the unconfined aquifer. And just keep doing that with all of our piezometers until we've gotten, again, the most concentrated part of that contamination out of the piezometers. You might have to do it multiple times depending on how contaminated your model has gotten. But I assure you that over time, that dye will work its way out of your aquifer. Once we've gotten most of the dye pushed out of our piezometers, the next step is just to let clean water begin to flush that contaminated groundwater out of the system. You might notice that down here, if you've got your artesian aquifer plugged, that this water, this dye isn't moving. So to speed that up, you're definitely going to want to unplug, remove any blockage from your artesian aquifer, and you should start to see that red dye from the confined aquifer basically start pushed out of that artesian well. Make sure both bottles are situated in allowing water to enter both sides of the model. That's going to allow the groundwater to clean up much quicker. You might notice this side cleans up much quicker than this side, and that's just the function of the water's ability to move through all of this material here is much slower than the ability of the water here to get to the river stream on this side of the model. It might take maybe 10, 15, maybe even 20 minutes for this dye to work its way out of the model. Obviously, there's things that we've done to try and speed that up. So if you have back-to-back classes, it might be something, that cleanup process might be something you start sooner rather than waiting until the end of the class period to starting that cleanup process. But within about 15 to 20 minutes, you should be able to clean up the model to a point where you can probably get it ready to use for the next class. If you're fortunate enough that you have a lot of time, probably the simplest thing to do is just put clean bottles on, let those bottles sit, maybe come back a half an hour later, put another set of clean bottles on, let it sit. You can let it sit overnight even, and just keep doing that until that dye works its way out of the model. Again, the more concentrated that dye is, the more effort it's going to take to try and clean this model up. If you notice that you have a lot of dye down here, and you don't want to wait for that dye to get all pushed over to the lake or the river, one thing you can do to speed this process up is by starting your siphon, or starting that high capacity well. So I'm going to use that siphon, and I'm going to use this well in the unconfined aquifer to begin pumping some of that contamination, try to intercept some of this contamination before it has to flow all the way to the river or the stream here. So if we start our siphon, might have to try that one more time. Oh, here it goes. So we can see the air, and we can see some of it coming out of the bottom of that tube. Now we should see some of that contamination. Instead of having to flow all the way to the river or stream, we're intercepting that and sucking it up a little bit sooner. If your model stops cleaning up, it might be because your bottles ran out of water. So just keep in mind that occasionally you're going to have to check on it. If the bottles have run dry, then just make sure that you're constantly adding fresh bottles to try and keep that cleaning process going.